didn't give it the same strategic weight that this
Well, they
administration
didn't, but
did.
they went in, and they stayed in. Now, they didn't finish the job because then they decided to go into something else, namely Iraq in addition to it, which was a rather dubious enterprise. But I think given the circumstances after 9/11, we really didn't have much choice. I mean, the perpetrator was there. He killed 3,000 Americans. He had an organization. We had to eliminate it. The question is what happened after that. I was very marginally involved in that decision, very marginally. Again, a little bit like what I was talking about earlier, namely, I took part in some of the sessions in the Defense Department, the Secretary of Defense, regarding Afghanistan right after 9/11, when a number of us were consulted. But again, I emphasize consultation is not decision-making. It's a process of discussion, sometimes maybe of some use, maybe also to gain support publicly for the stated policy. But I remember conveying my view that, one, we have to go in to eliminate Al-Qaeda, but do not stay in. Because I know what happened to the Soviets in Afghanistan. And I said, do not stay in. No nation building, democracy promotion, in addition to eliminating Al-Qaeda. Go in, knock them off, and get out. And that is my view, but...
Do you think that's the view of the Pentagon?
I don't know what is the view of the Pentagon now.
Because the Pentagon's, the idea of the need for some kind of long-term basis somewhere in the region...
Oh, no, I don't think that motivated us going to Afghanistan. Believe me, that I do know it was not the case. Now, there was a whole superstructure created by the Bush administration, which was maybe rhetoric or maybe they believed it. You know, it's a little hard to say what they believed in because they believed in a lot of things which turned out to have been totally untrue. But let's give them credit. They believed in building democracy by force of arms. That's a rather long-term undertaking if you're dealing with a society which in part is medieval. But anyway, coming to the present, that Obama inherited. We did not go in there because of oil. Afghanistan doesn't have that much oil. We went in there because we were attacked. But that does not negate the proposition that the region is important. What is important in addition to that, however, is how we handle the region. And I think establishing a presence, engaging in trade, creating more options, building more pipelines, east-west routes, new Silk Route, is a way of stabilizing the region and of exercising influence in it.
At least from the point of view of the Pentagon, and I don't know how you feel about this, you often hear when it comes to Iraq, we simply had to show we had the ability to do this. We could not be seen to be weak on the global stage. To what extent is that the issue in Afghanistan now, that if America is going to maintain its dominant power in the region, in Eurasia, it can't be seen to be chased out of Afghanistan by some...
Well, no, I don't buy that comparison. First of all, I don't think we had to go into Iraq at all.
I agree.
I don't think we went into Iraq
happened
to show that we're strong. We went into Iraq because we were sold a line of argumentation which was false and which was propagated, you know, intensely to the country. We are threatened because he has weapons of mass destruction.
But we know that they knew there were no weapons.
Well, I don't know whether they claimed they believed it. They claimed it was information. But let's leave that aside. That's an old battle. No need to refight it. Look, we are in Afghanistan because we've been there for 8 years. Now, getting out is easy to say. But by now, if we get out, quickly, the question arises, what follows? Is there going to be, again, a very sort of militant regime in Afghanistan which might tolerate Al-Qaeda's presence? And beyond that, there is now a new issue, namely the conflict in Afghanistan has come to be connected with the conflict in Pakistan. Pakistan is an important country of 170 million people which has nuclear weapons and delivery systems to the entire region around. So we have to think much more responsibly on how to deal with this problem. And I sympathize with the president's dilemma. And then last but not least, add to it the following. The president now has a very polarized country here. We are very divided as a country. We don't have a bipartisan foreign policy anymore for a variety of domestic reasons. If he precipitously disengages from Afghanistan, he'll be labeled as a defeatist president, as a president who's cut and run. And if things deteriorate dramatically in Pakistan, that will be added to this set of charges. And we could then end up, in reaction, doing even more irrational things. So I think he was over a barrel. My own personal view is, and after all, that's all I can express, is that we have to strive as effectively as we can, one, to Afghanize the effort against the Taliban. It shouldn't be waged by Americans, because then we'll repeat what happened to the Soviets. Secondly, we have to, in some fashion, cut a deal with some elements of the Taliban that are not really hooked into the Al-Qaeda line. They have a concept of what they want in Afghanistan, but they're not necessarily committed to a global sort of jihad against the West, like Al-Qaeda is. And third, just as important as the previous two, we have to find a way of helping Pakistan cope with its problem in Pakistan, but also help us cope with our problem in Afghanistan. And that raises an extraordinarily complicated question, namely, how do we give the Pakistanis the reassurance they want that if we leave Afghanistan, there's not a regime in Afghanistan other than the Taliban which is more friendly to India than to Pakistan?
Right now, if we talk about what is the Eurasia strategy, it seems to be based on an American-Indian alliance. That's not talked about all that much because I guess it might inflame opinion in Pakistan.
Well, that's for sure.
But the American-Indian alliance seems to be the linchpin of the Eurasia strategy.
Well, if it is, then I don't understand what the Eurasia strategy is, because if that is the alliance, then we're not going to solve the Afghan question. And if we don't solve the Afghan question, but the conflict continues, how will the relationship between China and Pakistan, which is quite close, be affected by an American-Indian alliance? And what will that do to the prospects for stability on a larger global scale between China and India?
Is there really any solution without, and this is kind of, I'm arguing against the thesis of your book, meaning, does the U.S. not have to start to withdraw as the dominant player in Eurasia and allow the Eurasians to figure this out?
Well, who are the Eurasians? We're talking about
We'll start
Afghans.
with India and Pakistan.
Well, we're starting with the Afghans, the Pakistanis, the Indians, and then the Chinese. You throw in the Iranians, and the Russians. I mean,
well, with the Shanghai Agreement, they're already starting to be cooperating with each other.
The fact is that to some extent, our participation in the Eurasian game is also a source of stability and prevents eruptions that could affect us very directly, or our immediate friends very directly. I mean, who are our friends in that region? You have the Europeans at one end, you have the Japanese at another end, we have some friends in the Persian Gulf and the Emirates, we have Israel, Egypt, and so forth. We have to take that into account. We just can't say, oh, this is for the Eurasians to solve, goodbye.
Wars begin for many complex reasons, but one of the roots of the current war in Afghanistan can be found in a 1979 decision by the United States to fund the Afghan Mujahideen in their civil war against the Afghan communist government. It was thought this could sucker the Russians into an invasion that would lead to the Soviets' Vietnam. One of the people who advised President Carter to sign a secret finding directing the CIA to take such action was his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski. In part 2 of our interview, I asked Mr. Brzezinski if he regretted that fateful decision. In 1979, Dr. Zbigniew Brzezinski was the National Security Advisor for President Jimmy Carter. One of his most important recommendations to President Carter was to support the CIA's plan to finance the Afghan Mujahideen in their civil war against the Afghan communist government, a full 6 months before the Soviets invaded Afghanistan to defend their anointed leaders. The Afghan communists had infuriated tribal leaders with edicts that allowed girls to go to school and women to work. Although life in major cities was quite modern, with women enjoying some basic rights, the communist government also alienated urban Afghans with their bureaucratic and repressive rule. An armed insurgency developed in the countryside amongst poorly armed tribal forces. In the book From the Shadows by former CIA Director Robert Gates, now President Obama's Secretary of Defense, Gates writes that the objective of funding the Mujahideen was summed up this way at a senior level meeting on March 30th, 1979. Walt Slocum, representing defense, asked if there was a value in keeping the Afghan